Does this scripture strike anyone else as very strange? Like really weird? Like, what's going on? Like, first of all, Jesus rolls into a new town. He just finds a dude, Philip, and he just says, "Follow me." And Philip's like, "Yeah, let's do that." And then the next thing Philip does is he's like, "Oh, I'm following this guy. You know who else should follow this guy? My buddy Nat." So then he goes and finds Nathaniel. He says, "Hey, this guy said, 'Follow me,' and he fulfills all of these prophecies." And Nathaniel's like, but he goes anyway, right? And then Jesus says these two things to him, and he's like sold. He's hooked. I'll get to that in a second. So I wanted to tell you that I read this really wonderful sermon from a woman named Reverend Colleen Wessel-McCoy, and she works at the Kairos Center, which is housed in Union Theological Seminary. And they really think about social change theory, and they think about how does faith operate within social change theory. And she spent a lot of time thinking about this question that Nathaniel asks back to Philip. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? And so I will spend some time, we'll do kind of in the sermon talk back, I'll give a little bit more of the Bible study on this text because there's a lot of interesting near scripture references that happen in this interaction between Jesus and Nathaniel and Philip that I think are interesting, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it in the sermon because I want to talk about this thing that I kind of gathered from this woman from the Kairos Center. She focused a lot of attention on this question, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And of course, our answer is yes, obviously, right? Like, Jesus comes out of Nazareth. It's even funny because in the Gospel of John, it's like not weird to say Jesus bar Joseph, Jesus son of Joseph, whereas in the other Gospels, it gets a little complicated, right? But in John's Gospel, he's like, yeah, he's the son of Joseph. That's his descent line. It's like not a big deal. Later in the Gospel of John, there'll be a lot of controversy about who is this guy? Where does he come from? Does he really come from God or not? John doesn't have as much of this interest that Luke and Matthew have about this virgin birth and the whole story about Mary, and we'll talk about this in the Bible study on Tuesday. But there is some controversy about where does this guy come from, and him coming from Nazareth would have been really problematic, right? Not only because the Messiah is supposed to come from Bethlehem, and everybody knows that, but also because Nazareth is kind of a nothing place. But we say, of course, great things come out of Nazareth. Why? Because here we are on the other side of the story. It's already been accomplished. It's already come to pass. We already know that this is Jesus of Nazareth who is the Messiah, who is the anointed one. But it wasn't so reading it from the beginning. It's only there from the ending. And I think about tomorrow. What's the holiday tomorrow? Right. And that's just like a lighthouse issue, right? It's good. It's unambiguously good. Talk about lighthouse issues being things that are obviously good, right? Like cold weather shelters. Obviously good. There's no downside to that existing. Same thing with the holiday for Dr. King. I have a dream that little black children will be able to play with little white children, right? That's a very kind of, I don't know, mundane might be too strong a language, but like, it's like, yeah, that's unambiguously good. Many of you were alive when that was absolutely not the case, right? When this was a real problem and this guy was a real issue. He was being targeted by the FBI, by COINTELPRO. He was seen as the greatest threat to the stability of America at one point in time. There were multiple attempts to get him to kill himself, multiple attempts to subvert and undermine his leadership. The fact that we have a holiday for him today requires a certain amount of forgetting about how difficult it was to get here. It doesn't mean that his movement wasn't righteous, but it does mean that his movement wasn't welcome. And not everything that's righteous is welcome. One of the things that was so important about Dr. King's work, especially right up to the time that he was murdered, was that he was really working on this pivot to the margin. Does anybody know about the project that he was working on at the time, right before he was killed? It came to fruition after his death.
Was it unionization?
No, he had done a lot of work with various unions, but the specific big work that he was working on was called the Poor People's Campaign. And the Poor People's Campaign was designed to enfranchise poor people, people that were actually on the margins, what we call now, the language we use is the impacted peoples, the people most impacted, from across racial divides, across geographic areas, calling them all together, raising up and equipping leaders to gather millions of poor people in Washington, D.C. in 1968 in order to actively advocate for a change in priorities. Because what else was happening at the time in America in 1968? We are engaged in Vietnam, right? And one of the things that they say that Dr. King was killed for was really when he started speaking out against Vietnam. When he started naming the fact that we have all this poverty, all of this endemic injustice in America, and we're spending billions of dollars to kill other poor people in another part of the world.
Based on a lie.
Based on a lie. On a continued series of lies that were becoming more obvious to the American people over time. And once he started linking racism with poverty and militarism, those three interlocking issues, that was when he really became a serious threat to the stability of America.
You had Malcolm X, you had the Kennedy shot, you had all.
Yeah, we had a number of leaders being killed over in that period of time, especially prior to that, building up to it, yeah. And so America was kind of a tinderbox in a certain sense, and people are looking for transformation, people are looking for change, and I think about the calling of the disciples in that same way, right? It's easy to look at this in hindsight and say, oh, well, you know, they must have known about Jesus because we know about Jesus. Well, one of the other things I think about calling disciples is, yes, it can be because this thing you're looking at is so compelling you have to go. It can also be because the place that you are is so broke, so problematic, so terrible that any opportunity to get out of there you will go for. Now, we don't know anything in the Gospels about what the backgrounds of a lot of these people were. We know some of them were actively fishing. Some of them were actively cleaning their nets. Some of them were probably just walking around. We don't know their context. But I think that it's pretty likely that if somebody came up and said, hey, follow me, and they don't know me, then the only reason they're going to do it is either because they see something on me or with me that they want, or the place that they're at doesn't have anything for them. And the fact that I saw them, noticed them, and invited them was enough to get them to come. And I think about maybe that's Nathaniel, but then he has this very brief interaction with Jesus, right? And already he acknowledges and recognizes his power. He gives him a bunch of titles. He calls him rabbi, which means teacher in Hebrew. He calls him the Son of God. He calls him the King of Israel. I mean, these are grand, and they start smaller, but these become grand and epic titles. And even rabbi has a certain amount of loyalty to it. There's a certain amount of commitment. You're my rabbi. You're my teacher. It wasn't this kind of global sense. It had this relational component to it. And so that tells me that Nathaniel is sitting there longing for some kind of intervention, longing for some kind of change in his life. That there's something that needs a strong leader to come and help him out of it. But what I love is that Jesus' response is like, oh man, did you trust in me because I pointed out this one thing to you? And there's possibility this is reference to another piece of scripture about everyone will sit under his own vine and fig tree, this kind of promise of the Messianic kingdom. That's possible. It's also possible that he was sitting under a fig tree a couple hours earlier and Jesus happened to know about it. I mean, we don't know exactly what the context is. But when Jesus responds to him, he's like, oh, you think that's the thing? Oh, dude, there's going to be so much more. You are going to see amazing things you can't even imagine. And I think about that when we put that in the context of the work that King was doing a decade earlier than he was killed. Do y'all remember learning about the Montgomery bus boycotts that started in December of 55 and ended in December of 56? It was a little over a year long. Do you remember that the thing they were actually fighting for at the beginning was that they wouldn't have to give up their seat if the back was full? That was actually the goal. If the back was completely full and they're sitting in the front and a white person gets on, they wouldn't have to give up their seat. They could stay sitting there.
And when
Rosa
my
Parks
husband
all.
got on the bus down south and sat in the back, the bus driver stopped the bus until he moved forward.
Right. Right, because it was violating a norm of the way that things are supposed to work. And the goal of the bus boycott was not to end segregation. It was just this very limited, because people couldn't imagine segregation ending. It was so entrenched, so pervasive, so constant. It was like, there is no world outside of that. Maybe my great-grandchildren, but certainly not my kids, and definitely not me. But we don't get very far from the Montgomery bus boycott before the whole thing starts to fall apart. And then we get the legal issues with Brown Board of Education, we get some of the wins, we get the Voting Rights Act. Things start to change rapidly, but that wasn't the goal at the time. The goal was actually pretty narrow. But when we read from the end, we think of it as, oh, that was what started, or that moved, that meaningfully changed, but that's not what was happening at the time. And I think there's some encouragement for us in that. Yeah, I think about Nathaniel, and I think about kind of wanting things to change doesn't really change things. How many of you in your life right now want things very badly to change? And wanting things to change doesn't change them. But things changing requires wanting them to change. So us, like Nathaniel, we have to somehow be ready for change. We have to find that the thing that we want and need change, we're hungry for, and maybe we're looking for, maybe we're looking around. You know, Nathaniel asked this question, but you know what's great about Jesus is he is never really critical of people that bring him honest questions. He flips people a lot of shit if they ask him questions that are really designed to trap him, you know, those logic puzzles. And he's really good at that, which I love about him. He's like, oh, you think you got me? I'm gonna mess this up for you. But people that come to him with honest questions, he's the most generous. He talks more to Nathaniel than he talks to Philip and Andrew and Peter. All of the other disciples he's brought on so far, he spends more time with this guy in terms of number of words than these other three that he brought on first. The other interesting part about that we have to be like Nathaniel is that we have to not be so rigid about where our help is going to come from, where the transformation is going to come from. If we think it can only come from certain places, then we'll only spend our time and energy and attention on those certain places. And he has to let go of this idea. He has to say, well, maybe something good can come out of Nazareth. Maybe something good can come out of this situation that's going on in your life, or this conflict, this issue. The question is, are we willing to come and see? Because when Philip goes to Nathaniel and says, hey, he fulfills this promise, he fulfills this prophecy, he fulfills this, Nathaniel's like, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And Philip's only response is not to try to defend, not to try to argue, not to try to explain. It's just come and see. And so the greatest demonstration of Nathaniel's faith is his willingness to go, to look, to notice, to pay attention, to continue to ask questions, even when he's doubtful, even when he's not sure. And the same with our own faith. It's not about our certainty or our security, but about our willingness to explore, to ask, to be curious. Are we willing to come and see those places where a little bit of newness, a little bit of new life, a little bit of growth is happening? Because if we are, then I truly trust that Jesus will already be there and already be leading us to greater and greater things.